Sound check 1.
Good morning. Welcome to the Governance Subcommittee, Governance Review Subcommittee, and I do believe we have quorum. I'd like to call this meeting to order. All electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. And Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Madam Chair, we have one small change to the agenda under item 10, discussion items. Item 10.2, 2025 Council and Committee Schedule of Meetings, FCS 24062, was originally posted as to be distributed. The report has been published.
Excellent, thank you. And I failed to acknowledge all of my committee members that are here. Councillor Crutch, Councillor Danko, I don't know, JD Vance. JD Vance doesn't vote, but Councillor Danko does. Anyway, and I have Councillor Maureen Wilson, Councillor Nan, and Councillor Clark on screen with me today. May I have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as amended, please? Councillor Nan, Councillor Crutch. Any discussion on this agenda? May I have your vote, please? Vote is up. And that vote carries. Thank you. Moving on to members of committee, declarations of interest. Members of committee, are there any declarations of interest today? Seeing none. Let's move on to approval of minutes from the previous meeting. May I have a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of the September 13th, 2024 meeting, please? Councillor Nan, Councillor Crutch. Any discussion on these minutes? Seeing none, may I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. And that vote carries 6-0. Thank you. We are on to discussion items. So let's start with 10.1, which is the governance work plan. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this item on the floor, please? Councillor Crutch and Councillor Clark. Do we want a presentation on this? No. Okay. Councillor Crutch, you are on this. No? Yes? Okay. Yes. Councillor Crutch, please.
Thanks. A couple things I wanted to make comments about with respect to this. Number one being, we have a memorandum on our agenda. I know this may seem like a minor activity. I'm excited about minor activities. So we have this memorandum here, which is a very much shorter form of a report, which allows staff to get things to us to share information without there having to be a whole series of cycles and reporting in the background. So I'm really grateful to see this here being used. It might be for the first time, just to give us a short bit of information. Probably was used before and I missed it, but the point is I'm glad that it's being used. And I wanted to speak to something here to ask the City Clerk a quick question. I know that in the previous term of council, because I was the one who delegated about this at the Governance Review Subcommittee in 17 or 18, asking that we have a review annually of the procedural bylaw to take place. And I think, I said November, I think everyone agreed, yeah, it would happen in November. I think it was a motion of council that did that. I could be wrong. And so I'm understanding now we want to move to sort of a every other year model, which I guess makes sense because you want to have time to collate these things and every year it might be too difficult to do so. Just could you share the reasonings for why we're moving to this? And if it was a council motion, do we need to have another motion to change this? Because right now it's just here for information.
Thank you. Clerk Trenum, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. At the moment, it's just sort of a recommendation that that's the move that we go towards. To the councillor's point, what I would suggest is if we want to sort of cement it, that it eventually become part of the procedural bylaw. Reasoning behind it is exactly what he mentioned. To do it annually is sometimes a little bit much, and what you find is the procedural bylaw becomes sort of a patchwork of rules and regulations and procedures rather than sort of a comprehensive review that allows both staff as well as this committee to kind of really get into the details of it and ensure that it's working for council and for the city. That being said, I don't really have an opinion either way beyond, I think it's a little bit more efficient to do it every 2 years, essentially partway through the term and at the end of the term, giving councillors time to really understand how it works and see, what's working and what isn't working for each term of council. But to that point, we would look at cementing it into the procedural bylaw itself. And I don't know for certain about the motion from council as to the annual review, but in either case, that's how we would address it.
Councillor?
Thanks. Yes, I think that if you're putting this forward, if you don't mind just having a gander to see if there was a council decision on this. I know that I'm pretty sure that there was one. And if there needs to be changed to a biannual review, great. I think it should actually show up as part of the procedural bylaw and be somewhere so people can see it and they can know they can rely on it. And know that we're going to be doing something sort of in the midway point and then something closer to the end of the term or however that works, start of the term, whatever that makes sense. So that there's some predictability for people, because I think one of the things you did this year that was really great, that hasn't happened before as far as I know, is you actually asked all council members if they had feedback for the procedural bylaw. There was a process for the first time to be able to give that feedback, and then when we get the report next month, I imagine some of that will show up there and there's a chance to have that discussion. So as long as we still have a marker in our procedural bylaw and a place formally where this is recorded, I think that this is probably fine. I'm not opposed to it, just wanted to flag those procedural issues just so everyone was aware.
Thank you, Councillor. Up now is Councillor M. Wilson, and on deck is Councillor Danko and Councillor Clark. Councillor Wilson, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. I'm sensing a little bit of enthusiasm and excitement from clerks, as usually mild that is. On the item 2, agenda management software for staff reports. 2 questions. This pertains to eScribe as a software, I take it, and their excitement comes from the capacity, I think, of eScribe to allow administration to manage their reports. And I guess my first question is, was that capacity always there and we weren't using it? And my second question is just trying to understand the relationship between that opportunity and what it means for members of council. I think that's captured in the fourth paragraph, but I just want to make sure I understand it. The paragraph that begins with staff will capture discussion and committee's direction. I'm not sure I fully understand the opportunity here. So those 2 points, eScribe as the software, the capacity it provides, we weren't using it before. Is that true? And then making sure I understand the tie to the work of the elected body. Thank you.
Thank you. Clerk Trenum, please. You're muted, Clerk.
Thank you. Sorry. Through you, Chair, to the councillor. There are 2 separate points. So points 1 and 2 of the memo really address the question that came out of the last committee meeting in terms of what the clerk's work plan is and sort of what we're focusing on. And these are sort of the 2 main projects right now. From my perspective, is this procedural bylaw update and the implementation of the agenda management. It is a capability that has been there for probably a couple of years, but hasn't been fully realized in its implementation, and that's something that I'm looking to do over the next 6 months, is to really ensure that it becomes part of how reports get from conception and from a template right through to landing on an agenda, and it allows for timeline management for staff, automation, approval automation, keeps records in a more formalized environment. That's sort of its purpose. I can't speak to why it wasn't able to be fully implemented. I can certainly say that it is not an easy task just because of the size of the corporation and the number of staff that have to be trained and sort of understand how it works, but it will bring a great deal of functionality and sort of ease to the process. In terms of paragraph 4, it is sort of a separate point, kind of changing the conversation away from the clerk's work plan to this committee's work plan, and trying to understand the discussion that now flows from this committee today in terms of what does this committee want to provide in terms of direction for projects to review over the next 12 months. And is there anything that in terms of governance functions that we can focus on and sort of could report back in the meetings that follow?
Councillor?
Thank you. I knew I sensed a clerk's excitement there. Thank you. I really appreciate you explaining that fourth paragraph to me. And although daunting, it sounds like the software has great capacity to assist the entire organization in its work. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. On to Councillor Danko, please.
Thank you, Chair. Quick comment and a question. First, I'm glad to see officially on the work plan realigning some of the standing committees because they are unbalanced and they're becoming increasingly unbalanced. So I think taking that on is definitely a good step. And then my question about the other capacities at eScribe, and this is going to be very inside baseball, but I think an important governance issue is just management of the speakers list. There is a strategy to where you are on the speakers list, and there's also, I think, an opportunity to streamline meetings where if I know somebody that has a similar point of view is already on the speakers list, then I don't need to speak. And it's, you know, not knowing where you are on the speakers list often leads to additional speakers just adding because, well, I got to make sure I'm on there. And when it comes to you feel like you have to say something, which makes meetings run longer. So if there is an opportunity to reutilize, you know, the screens or the systems that we already have, we've talked about this, but maybe just to state publicly, because it would be, just from my perspective on eScribe, it's not always reliable. You don't know where you are in the queue, and it would be much more efficient, I think, for our meetings to go back to the previous system, use the screen, tap where you are, you know where you are in the queue, and it's just easier.
So, Clerk, I know there was kind of a question in there.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I can somewhat answer that. It is something I'm looking at. I agree in that I would like to look into utilizing the system that we have in the chamber for that purpose. Where my questions that follow and where I still need to look into it is, what does a display of that information look like, ensuring that we properly capture those that are attending virtually within that process, and how does that look? I know that the clerk's team can certainly add people as hands are raised online, but again, it's just ensuring that we have a process and procedure in place and properly utilizing the technology that we do have in the room. What I can say is for use of other rooms, of course, as well, we are looking at some tech refresh in some of our other sort of committee rooms. So overall, I am looking at this process, and so is IT.
Excellent. Councillor?
Thank you. And just one thing I'll add is, as I'm speaking right now, I can, with my mic on, I can see how long that I'm speaking for. So perhaps that would also help manage, you know, our meeting timing, where you see right in front of you every time you're speaking how long you're talking for. Thank you.
Thank you. Up now is Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask, what's the dollar value or cost to implement the new module of eScribe?
Clerk Trenum, please.
No additional costs. It's part of what's already being paid for as use of the program, just not being fully utilized at this point.
So it's kind of like just turning a switch on and now we can use it?
A little more complicated than that, in that to activate workflow, and workflow really is based at, once a report is completed, it then enters an approval process. what clerks has to do is meet with the departments and fully realize what those workflows look like, making sure people have the appropriate permission. So there's some back end work that we have to do just to set it all up properly. And then some training for people just so that they understand what happens when they receive an email. How do they go in and actually approve a document? It's fairly intuitive and easy to use, but it's really just some work on our end setting it up properly. But it is turned on. It's functional as of today. It's just being able to use it.
Thank you for that. May I inquire, Chair? One of the challenges I think both the clerks and council, and for that matter, the general public have, is from time to time, reports are being uploaded at the last minute, virtually just before a council meeting happens or a GIC meeting happens. How will this program help us correct that? Because the challenge that I've experienced all too often is we get a rather large report that we're now expected to read a scant few hours prior to the meeting actually happens. And not to mention the public's in the same boat. If they really don't know what's in the report, how can they provide commentary to a GIC meeting? Will this new module that you're planning on using help that in any way?
So through you, Chair, it does in that it visualizes that process electronically. So right now, if a report is quote unquote late in terms of its approval timeline, it's done over email. It's done in a way that isn't clear to the person on the other end of that conversation that the report is truly late. Whereas in the eScribe environment, there are timelines that are associated with those emails, and they change color and they flash at you that this report is now late. That also becomes apparent to clerks, which means if we see a late report in queue, we can just move it to the next meeting, unless if for some reason there is a time sensitivity to a matter and it has to come forward, we can override that, but that would be approved through senior leadership because of reason X, Y, and Z. So while I cannot guarantee that there will never be a late report, this system automates and visualizes the lateness of a report that allows clerks to say bump it to the next meeting.
Councillor?
I think any tool that helps us overcome that issue would be helpful. Can I ask on a different tangent, Chair, with regards to the work plan itself? I do recall the procedural bylaw being reviewed annually, at least with the previous clerk. So new regime, new rules. How do counselors or staff bring things to light outside of that work plan schedule? For example, we find there's an issue with the code of conduct. Something was missed or something needs to be added. I am assuming that the normal process would still stand, that a councillor or the mayor can move a motion to address that, or staff, specifically the clerk's office, can bring a report forward with a recommendation that something in a policy be corrected. Does that still apply?
Clerk Trenum, please.
Yeah, through you, Chair, absolutely. No matter what schedule you put on in terms of regular and formal review of this document, it's still a living, breathing set of procedures. And if we stumble upon a situation that requires correcting, a motion to amend that can be handled as long as we're following our public notice requirements and all of that. We can still make those amendments within the year or as required.
Thank you. I appreciate that input. Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you for all the work that you've been doing on this file.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any other speakers on this particular item? Okay. Seeing none, we already have a mover and a seconder. May I have the vote to receive this report, please? And the vote is up. That vote carries 6-0. Thank you. Let's move on to 10.2, the 2025 Council and Committee Schedule of Meetings. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this item on the floor? Councillor Crutch and Councillor Maureen Wilson. Oh, Councillor Nan said yes. So we'll go with Councillor Crutch and Councillor Nan. Any discussion on this item? Councillor Crutch, please.
Thanks for comment and a question. I'm really grateful to see this here. And I think it's an important move forward in terms of making our schedule a lot more consistent and efficient. And so right now, based on the time of year, you'd have a lot of meetings that ran into each other in terms of a council week, a committee week, a council week, like they would bump into one another. And then we'd always get into trouble when there'd be report timelines and deadlines coming forward, and those reports would have such a short window to make it out to the public and to council. Sometimes we get a couple of days, we go over a weekend, these kinds of things. And so my understanding about the implication of this, and it's not in this report, and I wanted to ask the clerk about it, was two things. One, that week that you've kind of called maybe as off right now, really that's going to be a week where I think most subcommittees, boards, agency meetings will be happening anyways. And so it's not really off, it's just that we don't schedule those things as far in advance. And so generally speaking, there could be a banner across there if you revise it, just saying this is when those things will primarily be happening. So it doesn't give the public the impression that we're not doing something during those weeks. But could you maybe unpack that a little bit more, and also unpack sort of the impact of this and what's going to have on how we're able to do things at City Hall and make them better? Like basically, what some of the reasoning is for why this change is being made.
So Clerk Trenum, there are two questions in there. Hope you got both of them.
Yeah, I believe I did. So the first one, what looks like an off week, absolutely. It's a week without the standing committee scheduled or council specifically scheduled that will be available for two things. One being subcommittees, advisory committees, what have you, can be scheduled in there with a little more freedom, knowing that we're not going to be impacting any of the other standing committees or other areas. And that's a regular occurrence to have that. So if you have a subcommittee, will always happen before the standing committee, which happens before the council committee, and then there's some regularity to it. This is what I've seen as standard in a number of municipalities because it every 3 weeks the cycle repeats. And I found that the way it's currently listed in our procedural bylaw to be a little bit confusing. Oftentimes for staff, because as the month changes, you either have one cycle or two cycles, and the cycles are pushed right up against each other, which makes turnaround on reports difficult. Sometimes you're writing two different reports going to do different cycles right at the same time. And, there's just some difficulty that's associated with that. It also allows, with the regularity, an bit of ease in terms of clerks in setting those requirement timelines. So if we are going to say publish every standing committee 1 week before that committee, we can then backtrack a little bit easier. So if your report is due to clerks 1 week before the committee date for publishing, then you have to have it perhaps to the city manager's office or the general manager for approval 1 week before that. And then 1 week before that, you might have to have your director review it, which means you're writing this 3 to 4 weeks out of an actual committee meeting. But knowing that that cycle repeats every 3 weeks, that calculation is a little more natural and easier for somebody to kind of follow and backtrack. Really, it's about sort of that efficiency piece. It's trying to create some regularity in terms of the meeting cycles, the report writing, creating that room between cycles for staff to write those reports and to hold some of those subcommittee meetings.
Thanks. And so by consequence, one of the implications here is the public will see things now a week out from a report, which is huge as far as I'm concerned, because they'll be able to have time to review something for a couple of days if they wish to, and there's time for them to put a delegation request in. Right now, some of those timelines are a little shorter depending on if there's a committee happening on a certain day of a week. We're often releasing things on Wednesdays, sometimes when there's a committee, or Thursdays when there's a committee meeting on a Monday. These kinds of things sometimes happen depending on how holidays and weekends work. So having a full week seems to be good if we're going to be able to give the public notice to be able to see these things. Am I understanding that correctly? The public would have just more time now to see things, and as would councillors?
That's the overall goal of this. Creating that regularity allows us to reassess our internal report writing timelines and approval timelines. And again, my goal would be to give everyone as much time as possible from the publishing of the agenda to the meeting actually happening, to allow for whether that's delegations or anything else that might be required.
Thanks. Last thing I'll say is the other thing about this that's nice and that makes it predictable is before we used to have these kind of weird spaces where it would seem like council was quote unquote off for a period of time, for a longer period of time, because we were trying to adjust for this problem. And now because of the regularity, there's a clearer break in August. And that I think gives everyone more predictability about how we know when city staff will or won't be around, when council may be taking vacation, those kinds of things. So I think it is helpful for us to be able to see this in a regularized way, and I really appreciate this work coming forward and looking forward to a more fulsome report on the procedural bylaw in November.
Thank you, Councillor. Up now is Councillor Danko, followed by Councillor Nan and Councillor Clark. Councillor Danko, please.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick comment, similar to Councillor Kretsch's comments. I'm very supportive of this very common sense, if I don't want to use that phrase. This good change. I think there's a bit of perhaps a misconception that meetings are work, and I think meetings actually kind of get in the way of the actual work because we're just overseeing the work at the meeting, but the actual work is not happening in a meeting. So adding a third week into the schedule just makes all kinds of sense. It adds breathing room for staff. It adds, a bit of time for councillors to have better communication with residents in advance of meetings. I think hopefully it allows us to be a little bit better prepared for meetings as well, having a bit more time to ask questions of staff in advance of the meetings instead of asking those questions live on the floor during a meeting. And I think one of the ongoing frustrations for me is that we kind of continuously waive the rules or motions going to council and we're doing committee work at council. So hopefully, again, this third week in there gives councillors a bit more of a structured, as Councillor Kretsch said, to get those motions in on time so that we don't have to have, waive the rules to get them on the agenda. And hopefully it also gives us a little bit more opportunity to focus more on subcommittees, and we haven't even had advisory committees scheduled this term. So you add those into the mix as well. That third week is not a week off. It'll be very busy for all of us, but very, very, very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Danko. Councillor Nan, please.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the agenda that's in front of us, supportive. Just a couple of quick questions. I noticed and I appreciate that AMO 2025 conference is built in. This year, for example, we had our largest delegation of council members attending. I know that is the kind of priority in terms of our council members' participation in direct government relations work. It also occurs with FCM so far as the sole FCM representative on the board. It doesn't negate my council colleagues from joining me at FCM. Wondering if the clerk would consider putting those dates in as well. The mayor also does attend FCM.
Clerk Turnham, please.
Yeah, through you, Chair. The agenda, we did look at it with FCM as sort of one of those issues to make sure that we weren't blocking that off, because I know that there are some people that attend that, including the mayor and yourself. This really is just a visualization of it. It's more of an internal document that we made public, so it's very easy for everybody to see what that schedule looks like, but it's not an issue to reflect that in the annual internal calendar, just so that it's clear when it's happening.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, does this internal calendar also get shared with our boards in terms of Library Board, City Housing Hamilton, etc.?
So we'll share it in whatever makes the most sense, whether it's this particular document or whether it's here are all the specific dates, so that everybody's aware of when these meetings are happening. But yes, we'll share that information.
Thank you, through you, Chair, might be beneficial, especially for City Housing Hamilton. I know that the library board just meets on Wednesdays consistently, regularly, but for those of us council colleagues, and it's been mentioned by my committee members here already, in terms of those subcommittees and those board meetings, some of us who are on several subcommittees and on boards, it gets really, really tight. And there often are these like conflict moments where we have to divide up our quorum in order to make sure that we can cover the agendas and continue the work of those subcommittees and boards. So from that perspective, I think it would be beneficial to send this over to at least City Housing Hamilton. I would suspect the same for some of the other boards and subcommittees as well. Appreciate it, although appreciate it and looking forward to the benefit of having this structure charted out. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Clark, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of quick questions, please. I think I heard Clerk Trenum indicate that there were 2 or 3 municipalities that were operating on this type of schedule. Can we know which municipalities that Clerk is aware of that are utilizing this schedule?
Yep. Through you, Chair. So me coming from Niagara, I'm familiar with the ones in Niagara that are doing this. I know that Thorold is. I know that Niagara Region was, although Niagara Region, I believe last year has instead moved to monthly meetings instead of the every 3 weeks. So there's a little bit difference from municipality to municipality. What I like about it more than just specifically the 3 weeks is the regularity. So whether it's, 1 meeting a month that they're doing in Niagara or every 3 weeks, like I know they're doing in Thorold and I believe Fort Erie, is just that regular motion to the cycle so that you can expect 3 weeks from now, that's when the next meeting is going to be. And that basically carries through the calendar year.
So it was only Niagara Region that you looked at?
I looked at other municipalities as well. Not all of them use a 3 week. Some of them use a 4 week. Some of them do the monthly. Ours was unique in us setting the specific dates that were. So, for example, it's for the month of January, it's happening on the 2nd full week, and then in February it's happening on the 2nd and 4th week, and then it was very prescriptive and doesn't necessarily take into account some of the other events or holidays, statutory holidays that sort of naturally move around the calendar a little bit. So what we were finding is with this, it's easier to work around some of those, so you're not trying to squish a standing committee week into a holiday week multiple times a year. I think we have one instance of that in this particular calendar, but in previous ones we've had a few.
Thank you for that. My next question, Chair, is about how this would affect agendas. So in any given year, from my experience, it's roughly the same number of reports coming forward from a staff to council. And now we're going from 19 meetings to 14 meetings. At least I believe that is the case. I might have counted wrong. Nope, 15 meetings. We're going from 19 to 15 meetings, but it's the same amount of workload. So same number of reports, give or take, that are still having to go to GIC, still having to go to council for approval. If we eliminate 4 meetings, how much longer are those meetings going to be?
Through you, Chair, it's an excellent question. What I will point out is that we've seen a number of meetings actually be canceled this year. So when I did the math, it wasn't really that much of a reduction. GIC is certainly a question, and what I've found is a lot of material gets moved to GIC that doesn't necessarily need to be. And sometimes we see one large item come forward that's going to garner a lot of discussion, community and from council. And for ease, we move it to a GIC meeting, which makes that meeting a little bit longer, but then takes it away from another subcommittee. What I would propose instead of doing that is for those 4 or 5 really large topics that happen in a year, we call a committee of the whole meeting. which you can hold in an off week, and you use that meeting for just the one topic. So, take any example of the really large discussions. We spent 3 hours almost on the tourism strategy, I believe. That would be a great candidate for a committee of the whole meeting to really allow input from delegates, to allow members of council to really discuss it in a committee setting versus a council setting, and allow all members of council to be present. But you also have those off weeks to schedule those. So this would allow for, an additional 3 to 4 committee of the wholes as required for those larger items to ease up any of the agendas that might get a bit bigger.
Yeah, I would have to disagree in terms of why GICs get larger. We move items to GIC because there is broad public interest and broad council interest, and some of our standing committees have a very small minority of council. And so that's why those things occur. I'm struggling because the actual workload, the things that are being approved by council in any given year, the volume does not change. So shrinking it from the 19 meetings to 15 meetings means you have less meetings to get that work approved, which means your meetings are going to be much longer in length, which will be more tiring for staff, more tiring for council. And I'm concerned about that. Moving to this proposal and then saying, well, we can have committee of the whole meetings. I was around when the amalgamation happened and the transitional board indicated that there should be no standing committees. They should all be committee of the whole meetings. And the binders were huge and the meetings took forever and were carried over many days. So I'm a little bit concerned that while the intention is excellent, the outcome will mean that we are going to have much longer meetings. And there will be need for additional meetings because we will simply run out of time. So those are my concerns, but thank you very much, Clerk Trenum. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other first-time speakers? Seeing none, let's move to Councillor Nan for a second-time speaker, please.
Sorry for taking a moment there for muting. I wonder if I could, through you, I know that this year is a bit of an anomaly, but next year and moving forward, is there an opportunity to get some predictability around GIC budget?
Clerk Trenum, please.
Just to clarify, you mean the schedule of dates for GIC? I believe it's actually now been published as part of the GIC agenda for next week. I don't have it in front of me, but it should be available through a report on that agenda.
That's for GIC budget 2025. Okay, so then, but moving forward, there's not an ability to have predictability to say that in a calendar like this one, as it is a GIC, that GIC budget will begin in, let's say, December, and these dates or these weeks in January.
So I don't know, sorry, through you, Chair, specifically the predictability outside of knowing that we have the weeks in between, or the third week of each cycle. That's when those meetings would most likely be scheduled. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
All right. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Crutch, please.
Thanks. One of the reasons I think that this is a great addition and will really impact and change things is something that Councillor Danko brought up a little earlier today. One of the problems right now is that, and we've had people, thankfully, from the public who've studied this issue. They say there's so many hours of report reading that's required for each standing committee and so many hours of report reading for city council. And the timelines for those tended to be rather short. By extending the timeline for that, it will give us more time to prepare, and I hope at our council meetings, and our GIC meetings, other kinds of meetings, that people will be able to come more prepared, and they'll have fewer questions to be asking that they could have asked in advance. Because I'll be honest, sitting around the table, I hear lots of questions and think, well, that was something that could have been asked in advance. So I think that we do want to have the ability to ask some questions in public, of course, because we want the public to hear those things and want to be as transparent as possible. But I think there's going to be a number of efficiencies created by a system like this. I'm hoping eventually that we do have more participation on standing committees from everybody on council, which will make this process even more quick and more streamlined, which you see in other municipalities where you have people doing it. If we need to organize some committee of the whole meetings, we have that space to do that now also. I think that's what the clerk is saying, and I agree with that. If there are going to be major issues or things that we expect will have 20 or 30 delegations, then we can put that specific issue to a committee of the whole meeting and address that separately. That gives everybody the time to focus on that issue, listen to it carefully, and not have it jammed into a meeting where the public and everybody else is sat here waiting. Like, it's another efficiency we're creating there. Right now what happens is there's sometimes an issue in the middle of a general issues committee agenda, but there's 7 things people want to delegate, and the person's got to take off 9 hours of their job to come down here and have a conversation about something that's frankly probably a 2 to 5 minute chat with them, but they're waiting through many hours. So I think this is going to create so many different kinds of efficiencies. I think it's important to let us see how it goes and trust that we're going to see many improvements here, and that we'll be able to be more efficient with our time overall. Also, I'll say lastly that I encourage us all to take advantage of the curfew rule that exists for 5:30 p.m. and to make sure we stick to that. If we're all really motivated to be doing that, then we can get out of here on time.
Thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions or comments onto this report? Okay. Oh, glad that Councillor Nan is back. I was buying a little, stretching that out. I was like, because Councillor Nan is the seconder on this. So seeing as we have a mover and a seconder on this report, may I have the vote to approve the recommendations within this report? And the vote is up. And that vote carries 5-1. Thank you. Moving on to general business or general information and other business, there is 13.1, the amendments to the outstanding business list. So there are 2 subsections, 13.1A, which is items to be completed and to be removed. 13.1AA is the governance work plan added September 13, 2024, and has been addressed on today's agenda. May I have a mover and a seconder to put this item on the floor, please? Councillor Crutch, Councillor Clark. Any discussion on this item? Councillor Wilson, please.
My apologies, Chair, for not indicating I wasn't getting a response. I'm just wondering, is it the practice for us in this portion to receive a summation of work that is outstanding presently, so that I could keep a line of sight on it, not just those things that have been completed, but those things that are still outstanding. And forgive me if that's what we do, but I'm just trying to understand that.
Thank you. Perhaps I'll ask Madam Clerk first, and then we'll go from there.
Through you, Madam Chair. We do have an outstanding business list for each committee. And you'll recall in September of last year, the outstanding business lists there was a review of all those lists and a lot of items were removed. Due dates were changed, and the outstanding business lists for subcommittees and standing committees were amalgamated into one large list that's available through eScribe. I believe that councillors are able to access that list. We did in fact have a question yesterday about making the reports that we can run from those lists available to councillors. So we are looking at that. I don't know what the answer, what the solution is or is going to be. So the most I can say at this time is stay tuned. And we'll be able to provide that answer. The lists are provided to senior leadership team, but they don't currently go to councillors anymore.
Perhaps I could also ask Clerk Turnham to weigh in if he is still available.
Yep. Hi there, Chair. I agree. 2 things to look into. A, will confirm councillors' ability to access the list through eScribe, just because that's the the simplest and easiest way to do that, because you can sort and look by, you know, committee or topic. Otherwise, we'll look at the best way to provide that information, just so that there's some transparency to that.
Thank you, Clerk. Councillor Wilson, please.
Thank you. Is it the opinion of the clerk that in terms of transparency and those members of the public who might be particularly interested in one matter and know they think it's outstanding, that be publicly available through the chair?
So perhaps I'll still look to Madam Clerk first before I go to Clerk Trenum. So Madam Clerk, is that?
Through you, Madam Chair, we typically have not made that list available to the public. It's an internal document, but I will certainly defer to the clerk on that as well.
Clerk Trenum, please.
I think that's a reasonable question and something that we can look into, whether that is providing it specifically on an agenda from time to time so that it's accessible to staff or to members of the public, or whether that is providing it in some other way that it can clearly be found. That it's just the best way to do it is sort of what we're talking about. So I agree that is reasonable. We just have to determine the best way to do it.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions or comments on this particular general information / other business? Seeing none, we do have a mover and a seconder. May I have the vote, please? And the vote is up. And that vote carries 6-0. Thank you. Are there any other business for committee to bring up at this time? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to adjournment. Thank you all. May I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn, please? Councillor Danko and Councillor Kretsch. May I have your vote, please? And the vote is up. That vote carries 6-0. Thank you, committee, for a wonderfully productive meeting. Have a great rest of your day.